They put my name on a cake shaped like a rocking chair. That's how it started. A rocking chair cake, with little frosting slippers on the footrest, and a banner that said, "Finally done!" in glittery letters that my daughter-in-law had clearly spent real money on. The whole family laughed when they brought it out. My brother Marcus held his phone up to record it. My sister Diane had her hand over her mouth, shaking. Even my son Derek was smiling, that polite smile he gets when he's not sure if something is funny but doesn't want to be the only one not laughing. I stood at the head of the table in the private room my wife had reserved at Carmine's, the Italian place on Holloway where we'd celebrated every milestone our family had ever hit, and I looked at that cake, and I thought, they actually think this is who I am. 31 years. That's how long I worked. 31 years of 6 a.m. starts and quarterly reports and international calls at midnight, and contracts that had my signature at the bottom and sometimes, when it mattered most, at the very top. 31 years of building something that most people in that room had never tried to understand, because they'd decided a long time ago that I was the quiet one. The boring one. The one who showed up and did his job and never made noise about it. And standing there, looking at that rocking chair cake, I realized they hadn't just decided that. They'd celebrated it. What none of them knew, not Marcus, not Diane, not my son's entire executive floor, was that 3 weeks earlier, I had signed a document that made me a silent equity partner in the holding group that owned the parent company of the firm where my son Derek was a rising senior director. I didn't say a word about it at the party. I smiled. I cut the cake. I let Marcus give his little speech about how I could finally learn to fish. I thanked everyone for coming. I drove home with my wife Linda, who squeezed my hand in the car and said, "You handled that beautifully." And I nodded and looked out the window and thought about the folder sitting in the top drawer of my home office desk, and I let the evening pass. But here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. This wasn't something I planned as revenge. I didn't structure a decades-long career with the goal of one day making my family feel small. That's not who I am. What I did because opportunities came to me through years of work and relationships and silence. The same silence they'd spent years mistaking for limitation. The consequence wasn't something I engineered. It was something they walked themselves directly into. And the walk started long before that dinner. I grew up the middle child in a family where loudness was currency. Marcus, my older brother, was a talker. Loud laugh, big opinions, the kind of man who could work a room at a backyard barbecue like he was running for something. Diane, my younger sister, was sharp and funny and had opinions about everything, and people loved her for it. And then there was me. Raymond. The one who read. The one who got quiet during arguments instead of escalating them. The one my father used to look at during holiday dinners with a kind of affectionate puzzlement, like I was a channel he couldn't quite tune in. By the time I was in my 30s and had been with the same company for a decade, the family narrative about me was already fixed. Marcus had started his own landscaping business, had 12 crews by then, was loud and proud about every contract. Diane had married a surgeon and lived in a house with a circular driveway. And I worked in corporate consulting, which to my family meant, Raymond does something with numbers and flies places sometimes. They weren't cruel about it. That's the thing people misunderstand about this kind of family dynamic. There's a version of this story where the family is villainous from the start, where there are screaming matches and deliberate exclusions and obvious malice. That wasn't us. With us, it was quieter than that. It was the way. The conversation moved past me at holidays to get to Marcus's latest deal. It was the way Diane once introduced me at her daughter's graduation party as, "My brother who works in business. I never quite understand what he does." It was the way Derek, my own son, used to joke at family dinners that his dad was the only consultant in the world who never talked about his work. He thought that was charming. A modest father. A humble man. He had no idea it was strategy. Let me tell you what I actually did for 31 years. I started as a junior analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm called Mercer Aldridge. Within 4 years I was leading client accounts. Within 9 years I was running a regional division. What I was good at, what I turned out to be genuinely exceptional at, was identifying distressed or undervalued assets inside larger corporate structures and restructuring them in ways that made them either dramatically more profitable or attractive for acquisition. I was quiet about it because the work required it. My clients were companies in transition, sometimes in crisis, and discretion wasn't a professional value, it was the entire product. The people who hired me didn't want a consultant who talked. They wanted one who thought, moved carefully, and kept his name out of rooms where it didn't need to be. Over 31 years, I'd built a network that most people in my family would have found unbelievable, not because it was glamorous, but because it was invisible. CEOs I'd pulled back from the edge of restructuring who still called me on my cell. Private equity partners I'd worked alongside on 3-continent deals who sent bottles of wine every Christmas with notes that my family never saw. A reputation that lived entirely in the world of closed-door negotiations and handshake agreements between people who'd earned the right to be in the room. My family saw the exterior of this. They saw the travel. They saw the decent house, the good schools for Derek, the comfortable life Linda and I had built. But they attributed those things to corporate work, the way you might attribute a stranger's house to some job. They didn't ask questions because they'd already filed me away. And I let them. Because it was easier. And because, if I'm being honest, I didn't need their understanding to do what I was doing. That changes when it's your son. Derek is 38. He's smart, ambitious, and has worked hard for everything he has. I want to be clear about that. When I tell you what happened, I don't want you to hear it as a father who resents his son's success. Derek earned his position. He's a senior director of operations at a company called Vantage Meridian Group, a mid-sized logistics and real estate services firm headquartered about 40 minutes from where we live. He's been there 9 years. He was on track for VP. The issue was never Derek's competence. The issue was what Derek believed about me, and what that belief had allowed him to do at my retirement party. It wasn't the rocking chair cake. I want to be precise about this. The cake was Diane's doing, and it was tone-deaf, not cruel. What cracked something open in me that night happened about 40 minutes earlier, before the food came out, when I was standing near the bar getting a drink and I overheard Derek talking to his brother-in-law, Kyle. I wasn't meant to hear it. I know that. And I'm not sure Derek would have said it differently if he'd known I was 2 feet behind him. That's the part that stayed with me. Kyle was asking Derek about work, about the firm, about the VP track, and Derek was explaining the company structure, and at some point Kyle said something like, "Does your dad have any useful contacts from his work? Could he help you network at all?" And there was a pause. And Derek said, and I remember this with complete clarity because I've replayed it many times since, "Dad's been in consulting forever, but honestly it's pretty niche. He doesn't really run in those circles. He's not really a player, you know? He's always been more of a worker bee." Worker bee. I stood there with my drink for a moment. Then I went back to the table and I sat down, and I had dinner with my family, and I smiled, and I let Marcus give his speech, and I let Diane bring out the cake, and I let Derek take a video of me pretending to laugh at the frosting rocking chair. And I thought about the folder in my desk. And I decided not to say anything yet. The document I'd signed 3 weeks before my retirement party was the result of an 18-month private negotiation that nobody in my family knew about, because it had nothing to do with my day job and everything to do with the network I'd spent 3 decades building in silence. A private equity group called Sternfeld Capital, run by a man named Gerald Sternfeld, who I had helped restructure a failing hotel portfolio for in 2009, had been quietly assembling a holding company that controlled interests in several mid-sized service sector firms. Gerald had brought me in as a strategic advisor to the group 2 years before my retirement, and when the formal holding structure was finalized, he'd offered me an equity partnership stake in recognition of the role I'd played in building the portfolio strategy. I had accepted. The holding company was called ArcPoint Group. ArcPoint Group had a majority stake in a parent entity called Lighthouse Operational Holdings. Lighthouse Operational Holdings owned 63% of Vantage Meridian Group, the company where my son Derek was a senior director, 4 months away from his VP review. I want to say again, I did not plan this. I did not structure my investment to circle back to Derek's employer as some kind of elaborate setup. The world of mid-sized corporate holdings is smaller than people think, and the chain of ownership I just described was something I became fully aware of only after I had already signed with ArcPoint. When I traced the portfolio and saw the name Vantage Meridian on the asset list, I sat with it for a long time before I decided what, if anything, to do. What I decided was nothing yet. I would retire. I would attend my party. I would let the chapter close. And then I would figure out what kind of partner I intended to be. 6 weeks after the party, I got a call from Gerald Sternfeld. He was forming a performance review advisory board, a small group of ArcPoint partners who would weigh in on executive and senior leadership evaluations at the portfolio companies. It wasn't standard practice for equity partners at my level, but Gerald ran an unusually hands-on structure, and he valued my judgment on organizational talent, which had been part of what I'd contributed to the portfolio build. He asked if I'd participate. I said yes. 3 days later, I received a packet in the mail. 12 names. Senior directors and above at ArcPoint portfolio. Companies who were up for promotion evaluation in the next quarter. There were brief profiles, performance summaries, and a request for advisory input on each. Name 7 on the list was Derek Allen Whitmore, Senior Director of Operations, Vantage Meridian Group. I looked at that name for a long time. Then I set the packet down and called Linda into the room and showed her. She looked at it. She looked at me. She said, "Raymond, what are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to do my job." Now let me tell you what happened in the 30 days between that phone call and the moment my son finally found out. I reviewed all 12 files with the same rigor I'd applied to every piece of work in my career. I made notes. I asked follow-up questions through Gerald's office. I requested supplemental materials on 2 of the candidates. I gave honest, specific, documented assessments of each person's performance, strategic value, and readiness for advancement. Derek's file was strong. I want to be honest about that. His numbers were good. His operational record was solid. His team retention scores were above average, and the qualitative feedback from his peers was largely positive. I did not undermine him. I did not write a damaging assessment. I did not use the position to punish him for what he'd said at the bar about worker bees. What I wrote was a thorough, detailed, senior-level evaluation that was signed with my full name and title as ArcPoint Equity Partner, and submitted through the official advisory process. And then I waited. I should tell you how Derek found out, because the way it happened mattered. He didn't find out because I told him. He didn't find out because of a dramatic confrontation I engineered. He found out the way powerful things have a habit of surfacing, through the ordinary mechanics of a professional world where, eventually, documents get read and names get recognized. His VP review was conducted by the Vantage Meridian executive team with input from the Lighthouse Operational Holdings Oversight Committee, which had in turn received the ArcPoint Advisory Board submissions. At some point during the review process, his direct supervisor, a man named Carl Reeves, the Chief Operations Officer, pulled Derek into his office for a standard review preview meeting, which is a courtesy conversation before the formal decision. And in that meeting, Carl mentioned that the advisory package had included some exceptional outside commentary on his file. He said, and this came back to me later through Derek, in a very different kind of conversation, that the advisory note had been among the most detailed and professionally rigorous he'd seen in his time at the company, and that it had clearly come from someone with serious operational experience at a high level. Derek asked who wrote it. Carl showed him the cover page of the submission. Raymond Whitmore, Equity Partner, ArcPoint Group. Derek went quiet, according to Carl. He sat there for a moment. And then he said, "Can I ask, what is ArcPoint's relationship to this company?" Carl explained the ownership chain. The room went very still. Derek called me that evening at 7:14. I know because I looked at my phone when it rang and I had a feeling it was him, and I noted the time without fully knowing why. He didn't say hello. He said, "Dad?" How long have you known? I said. About the portfolio? About 8 months. There was silence. He said. You never said anything. I said. No. Another silence. Longer this time. He said. Why didn't you tell me? And this is the part of the conversation I'd thought about for weeks. Not what I would say to hurt him. Not what I would say to prove a point. Just what was true. I said. Because I needed to know what I was to you before you knew what I was to them. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, The party. I said. Among other things. I want to be precise about what happened next, because this is the part people usually get wrong when they tell stories like this one. Derek did not collapse. He's not that kind of man, and I've never wanted that from him. He didn't grovel or perform some dramatic apology scene that I can replay for satisfaction. What happened between us was harder and more real than that. He came to the house 2 days later. Not with Kyle, not with his wife, not with any audience. Just him. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd done homework as a kid, and he said, I need to understand what I've been missing. That sentence cost him something. I could see it. I made coffee and I sat across from him, and for the first time in 31 years, I told him everything. Not as a revelation designed to impress him. Not as leverage. Just the actual story of what I'd built, and how and why I'd never needed to broadcast it, and what the professional life of a genuinely effective person in my field actually looked like from the inside. He listened for 2 hours without interrupting. At one point Linda came in, refilled the coffee, and left without saying a word. When I finished, Derek looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up and said, I told Kyle you weren't a player. I said, I know. He said, I believe that. I said, I know that too. He said, How did you not correct us? All of us? For years? And I said, Because the work was never about correcting you. It was about doing the work. He nodded. Slowly. The way you nod when something rearranges itself inside you. I want to tell you what the months after that looked like, because the story doesn't end in a kitchen. Derek got the VP promotion. I want to be clear, he earned it. My advisory note was positive because his performance warranted a positive note. I would have written exactly the same assessment if his last name had been anything other than Whitmore. That's what professional integrity looks like, and it was also, I'll admit, its own kind of answer to worker bee. But what shifted was not his title. What shifted was how he saw the architecture of the world we'd both been operating in. Because once he understood what our point was, and what my role in it was, he started paying attention to things he'd never noticed before. He started asking different questions. He started having different conversations with me. He started treating Sunday dinners not as obligatory family time but as something closer to what they probably should have been all along, a place where a man who'd spent 3 decades in rooms Derek was still trying to get into was willing to talk, if anyone was interested. Marcus found out about our point at a family dinner about 3 months after the party, when Derek, not me, mentioned it in passing. I watched Marcus's face cycle through several expressions before it settled on something that looked almost like respect. He asked a few questions. I answered them simply. There was no triumphant moment. There was just the quiet rearrangement of a room that had been arranged wrong for a long time. Diane called me separately. She was more direct. She said, Raymond, why did you never tell us any of this? I said, You never asked? She said, We should have asked? I said, Yes. There wasn't much else to say. The signature on Derek's performance review is a matter of corporate record now. It's filed somewhere in a Lighthouse Operational Holdings document archive, attached to a VP promotion package for a man who once told his brother-in-law that his father wasn't a player. I don't need anyone to acknowledge that. I don't need Marcus to make a speech about it, or Diane to bring it up at Thanksgiving, or Derek to thank me in some formal way that makes everyone feel better about the years of benign dismissal. What I needed was the one thing that actually happened. I needed my son to sit across from me at a kitchen table and say, I need to understand what I've been missing. because that sentence meant he already knew the answer. My retirement now looks nothing like that rocking chair cake. I still work. Not from obligation, not from restlessness, but because the work is good and the people I do it with are serious and the outcomes matter. Gerald calls. Partners send documents. Occasionally someone flies into town and we meet at a restaurant, and I pick up the check, and nobody thinks anything of it. Linda and I travel more. We went to Portugal last spring. We're planning Scotland for next year. Derek calls me on Tuesdays now, which is something that never happened before. Not always about work. Sometimes about the kids. Sometimes about nothing in particular. But consistently. Every Tuesday. I don't know if my family fully understands yet what they spent 3 decades dismissing. I don't know if Marcus, in his heart, has made the full accounting of it. I'm not sure it matters. What I know is this. They brought out a cake shaped like a rocking chair, and they laughed, and they thought the story of me was finished. And 6 months later, my son's future at the company he'd spent 9 years building toward was reviewed, evaluated, and signed off on by the quiet man they'd written off at that dinner. Not because I planned it. Not because I wanted revenge. But because the work was always real. It was just waiting for the right moment to be visible. And some signatures, it turns out, carry more weight than anyone at that table ever thought to wonder about.